Good morning and welcome. My name is Leslie Parkins and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Civic Engagement with the Duke Office of Durham and Community Affairs. I'm thrilled to have you all here for the first Lunch and Learn event for the Community Engaged Scholarship Collaborative. These sessions are meant to bring together community and campus members and scholars and partners to learn from one another and to share expertise and lessons of partnership and impact. The goal of the collaborative is to deepen our individual and collective understandings and approaches for the academic and community collaborations we call Community Engaged Scholarship. I'm joined today by my colleagues who together are providing leadership and administrative support for the collaborative. Liz Shapiro-Garza, who in addition to serving as an associate professor of the practice of environmental policy and management, is also the faculty director for Engaged Scholarship with Duke Civic Engagement. And Rachel Earnhardt is a student in the Master of Environmental Management program and serves as the program assistant for the collaborative. And the collaborative also represents partners across campus who are dedicated to further cultivating and strengthening our knowledge and practice in community engaged scholarship. Those partners include Duke Service Learning, Duke Faculty Right, the Social Science Research Institute, the Forum for Scholars and Publics, the Duke Global Health Institute, Clinical Translational Science Institute, and Duke Civic Engagement. On behalf of all the partners who support the collaborative, we are so glad you joined us today. In the Community Engaged Scholarship Project featured today is Cemetery Community Classroom, collaborations between Duke and Geer Cemetery. This partnership focuses on Geer Cemetery, located 2 miles from Duke's East Campus. It was founded in 1877 by members of Durham's African American community and is a sacred place, as well as an archive of Durham's history. Having suffered institutional neglect lasting from the Jim Crow era through the present day, the Friends of Geer Cemetery is a nonprofit working to restore the cemetery's grounds and research its histories. In 2020, an international comparative studies service learning course at Duke called Duke Death, Burial, and Justice in the Americas partnered with the organization to research the lives of people buried at Geer. A Duke Story Plus program followed in summer 2021, further exploring issues of labor and African American burial and local funeral homes. Our presenters offer perspectives from a community leader, a student, and a professor involved in this project, revealing how community engagement with Durham and Duke can widen to incorporate the marginalized dead. I'd like to introduce Debra Taylor Gonzalez-Garcia. She is president of Friends of Geer Cemetery and has been instrumental in the reformation of the organization since 2019. She received her Bachelor of Science degree from North Carolina Central University and a Master's of Education degree from North Carolina State University. As a passionate genealogist, she has worked on her family's genealogy for over 30 years and has researched several people within the cemetery. In addition to the Friends of Geer Cemetery, she has been organizing an African American cemetery coalition to unite other groups with the same mission. I'd also like to introduce Nyrobi Manuel, who is a junior at Duke, where she is majoring in psychology and minoring in education and environmental science. Her interest in Friends of Geer Cemetery began when she took Adam Rosenblatt's service learning course, Death, Burial, and Justice. She continued her involvement as a researcher through the Story Plus program this past summer. Finally, I'd like to introduce Adam Rosenblatt, who's an associate professor of practice in international comparative studies at Duke and is a board member of Friends of Geer Cemetery. He writes about the intersections of human rights, social justice, and care for the dead. His first book, Digging for the Disappeared, Forensic Science After Atrocity, focused on the scientific investigation of mass graves as a window into both the past and future of human rights. He is currently finishing his second book, Cemetery Citizens, about grassroots efforts to preserve burial grounds of the marginalized dead, which features Friends of Geer Cemetery. Thank you to each of our presenters for being here today. I'll hand it over to them to share their stories of their project, partnership, and lessons learned along the way. Please just give us a moment as their presentation is pulled up.
Okay. I'm going to start us off and talk a little bit about the Friends of Geer Cemetery and Geer Cemetery. I appreciate this opportunity today. It's always wonderful to talk about it, and especially to share the stage with both Nyrobi and Adam. So if you could advance the slide, please. And you could go ahead and advance it again. Thank you. So first I'm going to talk about the Friends of Geer Cemetery. Okay, the Friends of Geer Cemetery was established around 2003, and it was primarily a grassroots organization at that point. It was established by concerned community members, one of them being Mr. Kelly Bryant, who has descendants or ancestors actually buried in the cemetery, no descendants in there yet, and some concerned neighbors. And like most organizations, it has its peaks and valleys. And after his death around 2014, the organization was a bit inactive. So in 2018, we worked at reestablishing it with a different group and quite a diverse group. And we've been moving forward since then. In 2020, we have become a nonprofit organization, a 501c3. And as a part of that, what you see here is we developed our logo, we've developed our mission statement, and as you can see, the logo and the monument that is on the right looks very similar. Yes, we modeled our logo off of that particular, what we thought was a headstone, but it is an architectural detail that was repurposed. So that was pretty cool. It's pretty unique. Spent a lot of time asking people like, what kind of headstone is this? Only to find out it was not an actual monument. Okay, you advance, please. You advance the slide, okay. So as a part of our mission statement and our logo or tagline actually is restore, reclaim, respect. And we use those as sort of our guiding light as we develop this organization. And as we develop the organization, I put things into these categories of what we did and what's important to us. And I'm going to start out with the education. It's important that we not only educate it ourselves, but also educate the community in terms of preservation. This cemetery is a perpetual cemetery. It's going to need perpetual care. And so our hope is that we're building a foundation for an organization that will provide that perpetual care. Now, will it be Friends of Geer Cemetery 100 years from now? Maybe not, but hopefully what we're doing, there will be something there to provide that perpetual care. And education is a key of that. We want to make sure that we follow sound preservation principles. We could go in there and within about 4 or 5 years and the cemetery looks really good and clean it out. And then we could have pat ourselves on the back. Hey, what a great job. And that's happened before. And then the cemetery is reclaimed by nature and a lot of other things that impact it. But there are many reasons not to. One is that cemetery represents the history of Durham. It represents the history of the neglected or not told stories of the African Americans who built Durham. And so we had to ask our questions. I'll leave you with these 2 questions. I'm not going to answer them. I'm not looking for answers. Like, why do we know much more about Washington Duke and not Augustus Shepard? Washington Duke being the father of the founders of Duke University and Augustus Shepard being the founder of the father of the founder of North Carolina Central University. Why would Maplewood exist as it does today and not Geer Cemetery? Maplewood, established in 1875 by the city of Durham as a public burial ground, and Geer Cemetery, established around 1877 to bury African Americans, only because Maplewood would not allow African Americans to be buried there. We work through our partners to help preserve the cemetery. We've got some longstanding partners. The Keep Durham Beautiful is one. that has been a part of a partner with this organization since the early 2000s, and also Preservation Durham. We built partnerships with local companies like Durham Marble Works, and there are many more. So I'm sorry I can't name everybody, but there are others. But those have been some long-term partnerships, because sometimes you've got to work smart, and you don't necessarily have the people, the manpower, and that was one of the things that Keep Durham Beautiful has provided for the organization, is that when there's low membership and you can't drum up all the volunteers, their purpose is to do cleanup. So they were able to do some of the maintenance work through them for years. Twice a year they would work through organized cleanups, mainly with Durham Tech and stuff. So we build these partnerships so that we can work smart. And it also engages the community. We do things, collaboration is similar to partnerships, but I think of those as being a little bit more short term, and that we can collaborate with other organizations. They may not have the same mission that we have, but we can come together on certain things. Stagville Historic Site might be an example of collaboration, but is also as a partner too. But in terms of collaboration, we can share events. They have a lot of information on a number of the people who are buried within the cemetery, so we collaborate with them often to develop these life histories and life stories. One of the first things we started out doing was communication, and that is informing the community, making the community aware of this particular burial space, and engaging descendants, people who have been disengaged for a long time, not necessarily by choice, but communicating so that we can bring all of this together, the community, descendants together, to realize the importance of this particular burial ground. And then, as I've mentioned a couple of times, preservation, and not only preserving the physical grounds, but also the legacies, the stories, and we do that through the research. So we research the people who are buried within Geer Cemetery, but not only just to keep it to ourselves and say, hey, we've got a story, but we share it. We look for ways to share it. So we share our stories primarily right now on Facebook. We have a Day of Honor post that goes out on the birthday of a person who's buried in Geer Cemetery, if we know their birthday. And we have other stories. We do this through events like this, where we can talk about the cemetery, online Zoom events. We partner with the regional AARP this past winter to present about the cemetery, and lots of other places. Duke University is one of our biggest collaborators and partners also. One of the very first events that we organized was a reclamation and monument restoring ceremony. So that's what you see on the slide, is the headstone that was selected to be repaired, and those are the owner and some of the other people who work with the Durham Marble Works resetting that headstone, in order that people like you see on the left side of the slide, who is the grandson and nephew of the two people that monument recommends that they could go back and visit it. He happened to be in town from Oklahoma. He had, we reached out to the descendants before this, and there he was, being able to stand by that particular ground that's important to him personally. And I would ask, did you ever know? Have you ever been out here? Because he had lived a great deal of his life in Durham. He says, well, we couldn't find the cemetery. So we hear those stories so often. So it's really heartwarming when we can see a picture like this. You can advance the slide. Okay, so I've already talked about the Day of Honor post. So on the left, that's an example of a Day of Honor post that was done back in March. So you can find the stories on our Facebook page. You can email us at friendsofgeer@gmail.com. We also are developing a website, and I sort of hesitated to put this here, and I went, oh, what the heck. It is under construction, so please be aware. You might go, wow, these people. But there are some pieces that are working, and on our Day of Honor post, we can only put a short story, because we actually put it on Instagram also. So there's a word count that we have to adhere to. But when we get the website up and we get these stories on the website, we can put the longer versions on the website. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to advance a little bit and tell you briefly about the cemetery. So the cemetery, we believe, has over 2,000 people that are buried in the cemetery. How did we get this information? Well, the current group didn't do it alone. It started some time ago by people from the WPA Cemetery Survey, going out and surveying cemeteries in the 1930s. They wrote down names. There was follow-up on the early version of the Friends of Geer Cemetery, looking at burial records and death certificates. And death certificates weren't started in North Carolina until about 1908. And looking at newspaper articles and family stories, that right now we have a list of about 2,000 names. Do we know where all these people are buried? No. There are only about 200 headstones. So those are the ones we know are buried, provided that that headstone has not been moved or anything like that. There are some headstones, probably some additional headstones that are buried under the ground, that as we get to that point of the preservation, we might find more. But so a lot of people, we won't know. We won't know where they're buried. That's just something we won't know. We've been fortunate. We have received a grant to do an archaeological survey, which will help us map out where there are burials. So hopefully we have that, because there is no paperwork on the cemetery, a map or anything like that. The land, the initial purchase that we have found for the land was in 1877 by three men, John O'Daniel, Nelson Mitchell, and Willis Moore. And they purchased the land from Jesse and Polly Geer. They were farm owners. This is out in like the northeast portion of Durham, just below today I-85. And all of that was farmland. Now, we have heard lores that there were burials before this time, but again, those are just verbal stories and nothing that we can prove by any particular records. At the time, this land was in Orange County. Durham County was not formed until 1881. And as I mentioned before, when I asked the question about why does Maplewood exist as it does in Geer Cemetery, this is a direct result of Maplewood, the city-owned cemetery, not allowing African Americans to be buried there. So what did they, I mean, they had to bury people. And unless you were a member of a church and there was a church cemetery, where were people going to be buried? So the community responded to that by creating these sort of public or community burial grounds. And Geer Cemetery is just one of the several that are here in Durham. It is, out of the three largest one, it's the only one that is still intact today. One of them is part of the Durham Freeway, and another one is a church parking lot. So it is, during this time frame, it is probably the only one that is completely intact. The cemetery closed around 1930 because of overcrowdedness. The city declared it closed. There were too many burials in there. But at this time, the city had opened a public burial ground for African Americans. And it too was a response of the times, the segregationist ideas of the times, in that they didn't extend Maplewood. What they did was created a separate but equal. But at the same time, the community was asking, well, make that Geer Cemetery. We've actually have seen in city records where the community was saying, expand Geer Cemetery, make it the African American cemetery. But that community was starting to be developed out there, and the white citizens who were moving into the area were going no, and of course the city went along with that. And so the separate cemetery, which is called Beechwood, which still exists, was like at least 5 to 6 miles south of this particular cemetery. And it kind of added to the demise of Geer Cemetery, because we look at how did Geer Cemetery get in the state that it was in, unkept and uncared for? while people were being diverted to Beechwood, there actually were burials that were removed out of Geer Cemetery and moved into Beechwood around the 1930s. And with the community growing and not probably being very friendly to just people coming out there, fewer and fewer people were coming out and taking care of the cemetery. And so it soon ended up in a state of neglect. And as generations went on, people who were unaware of it. Okay, you can advance the slide. Okay, so just a few more photos to tell the story of the cemetery. We do believe when the cemetery was created that there must have been some type of cemetery committee, even though we don't have written records, because I told you about the first deed. We have since found 2 other deeds with additional names. So it gives us the idea that there was some kind of cemetery committee, and also in a number of the city directories, which you see up there at the top left, that Siemens Durham directory, there was a caregiver, Mr. Riley Gearmore. We had seen him as a caregiver for quite some time. So we know that, there was care into the cemetery at one point. We just don't have written records. But with nature, with it, probably vandalism and just neglect, there were things that happen in the cemetery, such as the left. There are broken headstones that have fallen over, that happen for various reasons. We also have had the results of encroachment, where neighbors have tried to take over cemetery land, with one of the latest ones happening in 2018. And you can't see it very well, but there's a huge tree laying down towards the back, and that tree was felled by a neighbor. There's actually 2 of them, and there are damaged headstones as a result of that. And if you were to go out there today, you could still see this, because we are been working on trying to get this tree removed, but you just can't send equipment into the cemetery, remove it without doing additional damage. So we are working on that. We're actually hoping also to do something creative with that wood from that tree, provided we can get it out of there before it gets in too bad of a shape, type of thing. So we've had encroachment. One of our challenges, if you look at the table towards the bottom, is that you see owner, it's unknown, it's considered abandoned. Technically, it belongs to descendants of all those people on those various deeds. But now you're talking of researching generations, and at this point, maybe even hundreds of people that might be involved. So it's considered abandoned. So there are no clear owners, and that is something that the Friends of Geer Cemetery have looked at. Should we leave it as this, or should we force an owner, or what? What are the pros and cons to both? And we don't really have an answer. We do know the cemetery has had a number of ties to Duke University. And so that news article was this was Trinity, the predecessor to Duke University, was a janitor there. And on the previous slide, I'm sorry, that's old school foils. In the previous slide, there was a monument for Mary Sparkman, who had worked for the Dukes. So we have a number of ties to the university. We also know that there were fraternal organizations that worked with the community with burial, and that monument at the top, which you can't see the writing, was the Odd Fellows, which is one of the fraternal organizations that we've seen out there in the cemetery. So that was a very quick view. My colleagues will tell you a little bit more and tell you a little bit stories, but if you advance the slide, I do want to end with, why am I here? What drew me to Geer Cemetery? I'm driven by the history. I'm driven by its really quiet, unkept beauty. I think this is, it's a beautiful picture. It's in the fall. What you can't see in this picture are the sunken graves and, some of the disarray, but it has a quiet beauty. And I look at it as I have no ancestors buried in this. My ancestors are buried in a similar place in Virginia, in the mountains of Virginia, that I can't go up, because of distance and time, to help take care of, and I would love to take care of it. So this is sort of like my surrogate. But as I research the stories, the stories are the same. They tell the African American experience post-emancipation and through Reconstruction and through the Jim Crow period. I see the lives of my ancestors, of my genetic ancestors in this cemetery. So in that respect, it is personal to me. But I also see the lives of the history of Durham here that is a part of my community now, that I don't hear told, that I think needs to be told. And I think all of us, when we have a final resting space, we want it to be a perpetual resting space. And we probably think, it's gonna look just like it looks the day that we're placed there. Why should their story be any different? So I'm now going to turn it over to one of my colleagues, Adam.
All right. Yes, thank you so much. And I want to echo Deborah's thanks to Leslie, Liz, and Rachel for this invitation, and really for this whole series, which seems like a really important space on campus that's been opened up for conversation about community engaged work. And it's always a pleasure to keep collaborating with Debra and Nyrobi. Can we advance the slide? So Deborah just mentioned the quiet fall beauty of Geer Cemetery. Here's just something I jotted in my notebook on a fall day just the other day. In what subtle way is the wind's path altered by the headstones in Geer Cemetery? And you can advance the slide, Liz, thanks. And then I'll I guess I'm going to begin where Deborah ended, which is, what do I bring to this work and what brings me to it? Part of it is definitely deeply personal. I have 3 grandparents who are Holocaust survivors, who lost basically entire families, parents, siblings, nieces, nephews, but also young families that they had started before the war. So my grandfather lost his first wife and his 10-year-old daughter, Mira, in the liquidation of the Lodz Ghetto. And I can go visit the graves of the, few ancestors I have, the grandparents I have who made it through the war and who came to the United States. But whenever I try to trace the paths backwards, I find nothing. Geer Cemetery is a place of conditions that are very far from ideal in terms of what any of us would hope for a sacred burial ground, but also a place of some hope for repair. And I think for me, that's in some kind of dialogue with the questions I have in my own family history about what to care for when there's nothing but obliteration, when there's no graves to find. As a scholar, as was mentioned in Leslie's introduction, I have a longstanding interest in how care is bound up with human rights and social justice, first through the forensic scientists who identified bodies after massacres and genocides all around the world, and more recently with this project, Cemetery Citizens, which looks at places of the marginalized dead where grassroots groups are doing reclamation work. And that includes African-American burial grounds, as well as the cemeteries at former psychiatric asylums, where the dead were often buried, anonymously under numbers rather than names. And there are, including right here in our state, places where those two things, where race and disability, race and mental illness all intersect as well. So this project, maintains that interest in human rights, social justice, and care for the dead, but it does feel very, very different because of the extent to which my community involvement with the Friends of Geer Cemetery and other groups, my scholarship and my teaching are all really braided together. And you can advance the slide, Liz. To me, community engagement, whether through teaching or scholarship, is about putting relationships at the center of the work. My previous job was at Haverford College. My kids go to Quaker school. So I've been exposed a lot to this concept of right relationship from Quakerism. But I also think you can find the same idea in feminist theory, which is basically that ethics is often best thought of not as the application of principles you sat and came up with, in some thought exercise, but is rather a never finished search for right relationships. And I think that's really important to think about and to share with students in academic settings where often ideas are valued over relationships and even commodified or fetishized. So in the rest of the time I have, I just wanted to highlight a few of the relationships that I think have emerged as really key to teaching in partnership with the Friends of Geer Cemetery. And I know that after I speak, Nyrobi is going to add some of her own perspectives on as well on the kinds of relationships that mattered in her experience. Slide, please. So there's a lot to say about connecting students to the community, about Duke's relationship with Durham, and I know this is a forum where those conversations will be ongoing, but I wanted to say something particular about asking students to be in relationship to a space of death and a place of mourning. We are, of course, living in a time when there is so much grief to go around, so many layers of loss, but I'm far from the first person to point out how few structures or spaces we really have to support that grieving. I imagine I'm not alone in sometimes feeling like I'm grieving the lack of space to grieve. So Geer Cemetery and African-American cemeteries like it are places where people had to fight for and organize for the right to be able not just to bury their dead in dignity, but also to mourn. And NC Mutual Life, that famous engine of African-American wealth here in Durham, not everybody knows that the first product they sold was burial insurance because African-Americans couldn't get it from the big New York-based insurance companies. So the desire to have places to mourn and to have dignified burial are deeply intertwined with what Durham is as a landscape and a city. That said, as Deborah mentioned, Durham has places like Geer that have been degraded but are being reclaimed and cared for. And it also has places of oblivion, like the ones where, my family tree have disappeared into. It has Violet Park Cemetery under pavement, or as our colleague at NCCU, Charles Johnson, has described, there are Black graves under the water in Falls Lake. So we live in a map of places of erasure and also hard-won places of mourning. And I like to think that the students that I'm working with experience the ways in which we're still in the flow of that history, which is dynamic. We're involved actively or passively in the fate of these spaces, what gets erased, and where there still are spaces to mourn. Slide, please. The other key relationship, or another key relationship, is with community leaders. I follow what I consider best practices for community engagement, which is the Friends of Geer set the agenda. I don't assume they want my students' help or assume what kind of help the organization wants. That's part of a conversation, and we respond to their needs. But I also think it's really important that the Friends of Geer is an all-volunteer organization. I absolutely acknowledge the economic anxiety and other pressures that our students feel, but it still seems that sometimes they're given a very narrow view of adult life and an emphasis or overemphasis on professionalization. The Friends of Geer, everyone involved, has other work they do and or family relationships, caretaker roles. No one did an internship to get their foot in the door at Friends of Geer Cemetery. None of us have a certificate in reclaiming burial grounds. We do the work, we make mistakes and talk about them afterwards, and we make allowances for the complexity of each other's lives. And I think that kind of an organization is actually a really important thing to model for our students. Slide. Thank you. There's so much more to be said about this particular relationship than I'll be able to describe today, but I think that students have a very different kind of relationship with archives and research because so much of our work so far has revolved around researching and telling life histories, as Deborah said. So I included this little image just to remind folks that there are no IRB protocols for researching stories of the dead. The dead are not considered human subjects. And students come into the work really wanting to tell the stories of the people buried in this neglected burial ground. And then are very quickly faced with archives where people disappear, archives that are fragmentary because women and people of color are either not recorded or are recorded only by institutions of surveillance and control. Sometimes only recorded through a white gaze that remembers them with disrespectful terminology or reduces their lives to how they were beloved employees rather than kind of full human beings. Sometimes my students have encountered in these life histories acts of violence against the self or others and have wound up facing really hard questions, which of course we support them in working through, of what should or should not be shared. Slide, please. So that brings me to the final relationship I wanted to mention, which is, of course, the relationships with the dead who are buried at Geer Cemetery. Like many of you, I'm privileged to work in diverse classrooms here at Duke. Some of my students, particularly African-American students, may feel the kind of personal connection to this cemetery that Deborah just described. The anthropologist Michael Blakey has argued that the descendant community for African-American burial grounds is not just immediate family, but is the wider community of the African diaspora. Of course, I also have students who don't feel the same intimate connection to the site or its histories, including students who are not from the United States at all. And in fact, a member of our Story Plus team this past summer, Huiyin Zhu, did her whole research project from China, and at the time had not yet ever set foot in Durham. She had done her first year of Duke virtually. So I think this leaves the students with a lot to work out in terms of who the dead in the cemetery are to each of us and what might we owe them. And I think in some, maybe not all cases, but in some, that brings students also to ask, maybe for the first time, what they owe to their own ancestors or what descendant communities they're part of. Maybe what's their relationship with the dead, ancestors or not, in the places where they feel they have roots. The main thing though is that I'm not looking for them to answer these questions definitively. Taking care of a neglected cemetery and learning about the people buried there is a slow and intricate kind of care work. It's not emergency humanitarianism. So we don't need immediate right answers or people starve. We have the luxury to sit with questions a little bit. But I agree with the feminist philosopher Carol Adams that one of the features of our ideological landscape we have to resist is what she calls a conservative economy of compassion, which imagines that care is always easy to measure and fundamentally scarce, as if care didn't always beget more care. So in a partnership that reaches beyond the classroom, my students and I connect ourselves to this particular place, Geer Cemetery, and to the marginalized dead who are there. And I hope that we're both enlarged and troubled by that. So I want to just end with a quote from one of my favorite writers, Ross Gay, which I think also really beautifully describes the work in neglected cemeteries such as Geer. These forms and labors of care, some of which we've always kind of done, some of which are emergent, we are inventing. Forms and modes of care utterly quotidian and utterly novel, though care is never quotidian. Forms and modes minuscule and grand, though care is never minuscule. Forms and modes and acts and events of care that become practices of care, structures of care. And with that, I will pass it on to Nyrobi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that beautiful setup, Adam. And thank you so much, everyone, for this opportunity. I am Nyrobi Manuel, and I am passionate about education. So my future plans after graduation includes teaching middle school children environmental science. In spring 2020, I took the Death, Burial, and Justice in America's class taught by Adam, where we learned about necroviolence, funeral practices, and the effects of grief. I used to be frightened to talk about or even think about death. And so I feel like that stopped me from embracing and learning about African-American death practices. After this class, I was very, very interested in learning about the patterns of African-American funeral and after-death practices, because I realized that my own experience was shared and was similar to others. In the latter part of the class, we collaborated with Friends of Geer Cemetery, where I enjoyed helping families piece together the life stories of their descendants buried in Geer. And I feel like oral storytelling is definitely a part of my heritage. And I wanted to combine that with my interest in African-American funeral practices. So I became part of the Story Plus Geer Cemetery Labor and Dignity and Practices of Freedom in African-American Burial Grounds research team. And in this research team, I worked closely with two undergrad researchers, and we used archival research to tell the history of the African-American Durham community in relation to Geer Cemetery and funeral practices. In the image to the right is my class pictured, and when we visited Geer Cemetery, one of the first times we did. And the quote below is from two of my classmates from that class talking about how much they enjoyed the class and what they enjoyed about it. It was written in the Duke Chronicle. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for my research, I focused on the funeral director, John C. Scarborough of Durham. In 1871, grocer J.C. Hargett established North Carolina's oldest Black-owned funeral home in Kingston, North Carolina. John C. Scarborough at this time was an employee of Hargett's grocery store, and Scarborough was very interested in this funeral home, and so he traveled to New York City and enrolled in renowned training school for embalmers to become a mortician. And in this class, Scarborough was the only Black student enrolled at the time. This enabled him to work closely with Mr. Hargett at the funeral home, and around 1907, Scarborough moved the business to Durham, North Carolina. In the picture to the right is John C. Scarborough posing with some of his workers at his funeral home in 1930. Having a Black-owned funeral home like Scarborough and Hargett Celebration of Life Center was extremely important for our Black community members at the time. Funerals are highly respected, well prepared for, and abundantly decorated. And death is and was celebrated because it was a form of liberation from suffering and enslavement. And as a result, funeral directors had a very powerful, influential role in African-American communities. In the bottom picture is a funeral procession in Monroe, Georgia, for George Dorsey and Dorothy Dorsey, who were lynched in 1946. Next slide, please. Thank you. John C. Scarborough and his family were very engaged with the Durham community as well as charitable. The success of the funeral home spurred several opportunities for care for the historically Black community of Hayti. One example being the opening of the Scarborough Nursery School in 1925. And this was created to help care for and educate the infants, preschoolers, and school-aged children of working families. As an educator myself, I find this very, very telling and very telling of the Scarborough family wanting to educate, wanting to help the community. I find this I absolutely love this, that they not only were caring for the dead, they are also caring for the little ones and just helping that community. And the mission of the oldest nursery home of the state is to develop their fullest potential, the children's fullest potential, by physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, as well as social means, according to their website. And a newspaper article in the Carolina Times at that time stated that the Scarborough Nursery School created a sense of security and a feeling of being loved. The children and parents adored the superintendent of the school, Clyde F. Scarborough, the wife of John C. Scarborough. Pictured, you can see on the right is a picture of a class in the cold, taking a little cute picture, and then there's a picture of kids playing toys during playtime. In addition, John C. Scarborough also founded the Funeral Directors and Morticians Association of North Carolina in order to create a close-knit community of Black funeral directors, and also served as a director of the Mechanics and Farmers Bank of North Carolina. From my research, I learned of how interconnected and how close-knit the Hayti community of Durham was. And I learned of the symbiotic nature of the Scarborough and Hargett Celebration of Life Center, which I loved. Next slide, please. My theme of this semester, I feel like, is realizing the significance of deep emotional connections and authentic relationships. The kind of relationships we grow and learn from, and the kind of relationships that John C. Scarborough and his family had with the Hayti community. I'm currently on the journey of supporting the wider Durham community through advocacy work, such as the Story Plus internship that I had this summer, and as well as tutoring. And as a future educator, I plan on and will not be a stranger to the community, but rather a part of the community and working to advance the community. And in my professional future, I want to understand and stand by the community that I choose to serve. And I feel like Durham is the start for that for me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. What a rich collage of stories too, about how all of your involvement with the Geer Cemetery. I love seeing that part as well. And I apologize, Nyrobi, for not being able to advance the slide as quickly as I should have. But right now we would like to open it up for questions. If you could, there's a couple of different ways to ask questions. If you'd like to open up the chat and ask a question in the chat, I can curate those. And if you would like to put up your hand, I already see one, that'd be great too. Please be sure to direct your question, let people know, let Adam, Deborah, and Nyrobi know who you'd like to have answer the question as well. But Helen Dixon, you are up. Let's hear from you.
Hi, thanks so much for all of these presentations. I'm actually a faculty member at East Carolina University, and we have a team of anthropologists and historians partnering with one of our local historic African-American cemeteries that also has sort of fallen out of the documentary record, and we're trying to sort of fill in those gaps. But I'm wondering from all three of you, if anyone has comments, is there anything that looking back you would have done differently as you started these community partnerships, as you started working with a university team, as you started your research? Are there things you would have sort of like, could you give advice to a team that's a little bit behind where you guys are? Thanks.
One of the things that I feel like we would do differently, and that would be informing the community. I think that was the very first thing that we started out doing. We hosted that event. We just wanted the community to know this cemetery is here. Friends of Geer Cemetery is here. What we didn't anticipate was we were still too young in our knowledge of preservation, and also too naive in terms of who might come. And so there was a conflict that we had to deal with as a young organization of people who wanted to be involved in doing something, but who did not have the same principles towards preservation that we had. And it was important to us that we preserve the cemetery. We, to go in and to clean up to me is to destroy. And we didn't know if there were artifacts there, because there are some burial practices used very early by the African American community that with the untrained eye and unknowledgeable person, you don't recognize. And we didn't know enough of that, and we didn't want to lose that either. But it's so easy to look at these cemeteries and go, wow, we just need to clean it up. And we need to recognize where we think there are graves in a way that's appropriate for us. but it's, you know, we want the cemetery to represent what the community was then, not what we think it should be today. And I probably should stop right here.
Adam or Nyrobi, do you want to add to that?
So I think whether I have anything genuinely helpful to add or not probably depends on whether you all are doing community engaged teaching of the nature of what I've done. Helen, is that something that's part of the?
Yeah, I'm currently teaching a public history course in which we're using some of the data from the cemetery, but we don't have the service learning designation for any of the coursework yet, but some of that's institutional.
So my main thing I would do differently, and I think this is probably for many of us who teach, is like always the thing that you arrive at the end of the semester is just like more time and space. The contrast between, and Nyrobi can maybe speak to this, my feelings won't be hurt, Nyrobi, but the contrast between the class that I taught, where due to also the global studies framework in which I teach, we were going from, political disappearances in Latin America all the way up through missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. We had a lot of kind of academic material from all over the Americas we were working with, and then we're trying alongside that to have a sequenced plan of community engagement with the Friends of Geer. And the contrast between trying to do all of that in the midst of a semester and have all that going on versus the Story Plus program, which was just like, let's figure out how a small team can do research together on people buried in the cemetery and what framework to place it in, was really huge. So I think never underestimating the time and space that it needs. And the other thing that I'm still puzzling through is that because of that greater time and space, I think Nyrobi's one amazing example of how the students were given more kind of exploratory paths to forming their own connection with the material. I think, Nyrobi, you'll probably agree that picking a name out of a list of people we needed researched for Friends of Geer, more or less at random, because we do need all those people researched and it all matters, but that versus the journey that Nyrobi just described of becoming interested in Scarborough and Hargett and the nursery school and its relationship to her wanting to be a classroom teacher. Just there's so much more force to those projects that were done this summer because of the ability for students to find their way into the research through something personal.
Nyrobi, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to kind of ask that a little bit, is just to be purposeful. I feel like I wish I would have been a bit more purposeful with the class, like choosing the passions and my interests and making sure that my actions go into that and being everything aligns, just being really purposeful with what I want to do as well. I feel like that's very important, especially when there are a lot of things at once that I'm trying to juggle, and just be purposeful with everything is very important. I feel like I wish that I would have had more of that in the beginning.
Thank you. And Helen, best of luck with your project too. Kathleen, let's hear from you. Kathleen Donahue.
Hi there. This was really very interesting, and thank you all for the presentations. Just picking up on a comment that Deborah had about the people who were buried in the cemetery being those that were not part of a church community. I was just wondering if you have any insight about the relationship between the Geer Cemetery and some of the churches, and also Nyrobi, just the whole vocation of funeral directors and how they interface with both the community and with the individual churches. This is just a landscape I'm not familiar with, and it would be very interesting if you could make some of those connections for me, if you can.
Deborah, would you like to start?
Yeah. So my statement about the not having connection to an African-American church, it was more of where an African-American church did not have a burial ground. There are lots of examples of people, religious leaders in the cemetery. For example, oh gosh, Margaret Ruffin, who was buried in the cemetery she came out of Hillsborough, an enslaved woman who started prayer groups, and that prayer group eventually turned into White Rock Baptist Church. And White Rock Baptist Church is one of the cornerstone African-American churches that is still here today. Augustus Shepherd, Reverend Augustus Shepherd, the father of James E. Shepherd, was a long-term minister who had also been enslaved and came out of Raleigh and the Overland Village. The Markhams, Edom and Millie Markham, are buried in Geer Cemetery, and they were the establishers of St. Joseph AME Church, another cornerstone African-American church that still exists today. So there are several other examples like that. So the cemetery is full of ministers, but my intent is if the church had a burial ground, people would be buried there. But because we were starting to form an urban development, you were seeing less and less of that. So there was a need for a community burial ground.
Nyrobi, did you want to comment as well? Thank you so much, Deborah. That's a great question, Kathleen. Thank you for providing more detail.
Yeah, I feel like Black churches really were kind of the foundation of after death funeral practices, and as well as Black churches becoming a form of Black entrepreneurship in Durham, tied with NC Mutual, especially St. Joseph African American Methodist Episcopal Church. Not only did John C. Scarborough and his wife attend the church, but they also worked closely with the church, holding funeral processions and burying a lot of the people that did go to that church. So there was that connection there as well.
Thanks, Nyrobi. Yeah, I think Kathleen, again, thanks for the question. That was really, important to understand that context too. I believe Liz DeMattia had her hand up, and I think maybe if she's still on, if she'd like to ask a question. Maybe she had to drop off. We do have a few minutes, and I do have a question. Actually, I think this is mainly aimed at you, Deborah, but feel free to pass it on if you'd like. I'm really wondering, you talk so much, I really appreciated your discussion about partnerships and collaborations, particularly the difference, when you have a partnership, it's a rich, very involved relationship, as Adam was talking about relationships. What do you see the relationship of your organization with Duke University, or maybe with an academic university? What is that? Is it a partnership? Is it a collaboration? What makes the difference?
Well, I think I'm splitting hairs when I go between partnership and collaboration at times. I do. And I think there are times that we have both. Now, I feel like the class that Adam held was more of a collaboration. One of the things I look at a collaboration is where you have maybe different mission statements, but you can come together to achieve a goal together. So the goal from the class was to expose the students, was part of the objectives of the class, but our objectives at Geer Cemetery was to have histories of the people. So we both came out with a win-win kind of situation. So I kind of look at collaboration a little bit like that. And a partnership is where we actually have a shared mission, maybe not in totality, but some piece that we share, and we can do things together. And you asked about Duke. Yes, and I think we've had both with Duke. We have both a partnership. Hopefully, what this has done is created, Adam's class has created other professors. So, and actually one was on here, and Andrew Thaler, we're getting ready to work with his class. They're going to do a monument survey out there as part of his creative writing class, and stuff. So then that's where, those collaborations start to come more partnerships. Duke University has partnered with us with some events that we've had, and helping us financially with the event, also with producing material for the event. So and even today, this is a partnership. So we've had a lot of opportunities, and blessed to have that, and looking to establish those with other universities. you know, we do have a partnership, an establishment with North Carolina Central, not right now, not as rich as we would like, but it's happening. But to involve all of there's so much work to be done. You know, you can't do it alone. You got to involve, and I think, you know, the universities has been one of our stronger sources of collaboration and partnership.
Deborah, thank you. That was really rich. And we're glad to be in collaboration or partnership with you as well. We actually, Kelly Sue, I'm sorry, I see your hand up, but we're going to have to cut it short just to be cognizant of the end of our time period. But thank you, Adam, Nyrobi, Deborah, thank you so incredibly much, especially for being the first in our series, being willing to be the first in our series of Lunch and Learns, another programming that we have for the Collaborative and Community Engaged Scholarship. You will see the link in the chat if you're interested in two things. One is getting in touch with us and getting on our mailing list and finding out more about the work that we're doing at Duke, collaboratively, in partnership and collaboration, Deborah. And also just to find out more about the programming, the other Lunch and Learns and workshops that we have on this topic coming up. But again, Nyrobi, Adam, Deborah, thank you so incredibly much. This was just such a rich presentation and conversation, and I appreciated hearing from all of you and all of your perspectives. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us and for all the great questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.